So it's a pleasure to be here to talk about a paper that none of us has written. So we're going to try to, be do as much justice as we can to Dan's paper. And I'm going to start by actually saying that when I read this paper, I thought, I just can't believe that none of us actually really thought about writing this paper before, because manufacturing has been in the news a lot. There's a lot of interest in manufacturing, and we often talk about it in the context of trade, but the regulatory side of things is actually extremely important. And Dan has done a very good job, and he's saying something that is really important that I want to read to jumpstart this conversation. He said, despite the varied and accumulating impositions thrust upon U.S. manufacturing, the sector continues to perform well overall, which is something we say a lot. He said in 2022, real manufacturing GDP reached a record high of $2.28 billion. And he said sector value added per worker also reached a record high of nearly $142,000, which was 50% more than South Korea, who landed in second place with this metric. And the reason why this is stunning is because he has, at the beginning of his report, which is going to set the stage for our conversation, this number. He said in 2022, the cost of federal regulations accounted for 12% of US GDP, or 20% more than the value produced by the entire US manufacturing economy. Think about it. Think about this. And the fact that we don't actually, when we're talking about manufacturing, we don't spend our time talking about regulation is a real flaw that I think this paper is going to change. So Kent, you're a regulatory expert. Let me first ask you, what surprised you the most in Dan's paper?
I want to first say, if you're not familiar with this, you really owe it to yourself to spend 15 or 20 minutes with what Dan has put together. And what took me aback was, I think most people approach regulatory questions with a little bit of a bias, right? And I look across this room, and I know that you are the exceptions. You are not the people, when somebody says, let's talk about regulation, you get me-go, my eyes glaze over. You're all leaning forward, even though it's after lunch. I looked at this with a slightly different bias, and I thought, well, why are we looking at this really interesting question about the hidden parts of government that reach into all different aspects of life and just using the lens of manufacturing? Isn't that a mistake? Like, why did he organize his work that way? And then I went through the paper, and I thought, well, that's brilliant. That's a really good insight that he brought to bear, because what manufacturing lent to the look at regulatory trade-offs, the costs and benefits, the accumulation of regulation from across different aspects of how we regulate, it gives us a window into all the other parts of the marketplace. And by going a little bit deeper on one sector, we can see better the effects that we tend to talk about in the aggregate. And that was a real lesson for me, and it was something that was counterintuitive and something I really appreciate about how this got framed. And it's one of the things I hope that you'll look for.
So can you talk to us about actually the regulatory burden faced by manufacturing, and actually by the economy in general, and manufacturing in particular?
So I think there's the best way to understand it in terms of manufacturing is some statistics provided in the study, in Chapter 3 in your handbooks, about per worker costs, right? So Dan's identified, if you're in the manufacturing sector, there's about 13 million people in America who work in manufacturing. If you're in manufacturing, the per employee regulatory burden is nearly $30,000, $29,100. If you happen to be a small manufacturer, which is not an insignificant part of the market, it's not all Alcoa and Ford and John Deere. There's a lot of light industrial parks spread around this country where people are employing 20 and 30 and 40 people at a time. If you're in a small manufacturing facility, the per employee regulatory burden is north of $50,000 per person. So just when you turn on the lights to start the day on a Monday, you count up all the people on your payroll, it's going to cost you $50,000 a head. That burden is every year, right? It's not like you can pay the one-time licensure fee and be done with it. You pay that burden every year, and that's an important concept for regulatory studies, the economics of regulation. We have both a stock of regulation, things that have accumulated now for 150 years. We have a stock of both state and federal, oftentimes, particularly around land use, some labor-related issues, local regulation. We also have a flow. So every year we get new stuff to add to the pile, new stuff to interpret, new stuff that we have to hire attorneys to help us navigate, new stuff that has changed from the way we got used to doing it over the last how many ever years. And so we have to relearn it and retrain our employees how to comply. And that flow of the federal regulatory burden, my colleague Wayne Cruz estimates at just north of $2 trillion a year. Dan, in the paper in front of you and in your hands, he estimates that flow, the every year new expense that we put on private enterprise in this country, at not quite 3 trillion, 2.8, I believe he documents. Our friends over at the Mercatus Center, they're double what CEI says. They say it's about 4 trillion. And I want to tell you that all three of these estimates are the lower bound. Right? These are very careful analysts where they throw out and don't count what they can't put their finger on. Because the upper bound of regulatory burdens on the private sector is upwards of 40 trillion. There's a lot more estimation, there's a lot more of assumptions that built into those models. That's why I'm more comfortable saying, oh, a few $1 trillion, 2 trillion to 3 trillion, as Dan says, that's about a third as much as what we tax and borrow and spend. If we have a $6 or $7 trillion federal budget, we've got $2.5 trillion worth of regulations every year. It's a lot of money.
What are the industries within? What are the sectors within manufacturing that are the most burdened by regulation?
Again, this is one of the insights that I think many of us might find counterintuitive, and Dan outlines for us. The paper industry, the chemicals industry, which I would have expected. He identifies transportation, which we had a great discussion on earlier yesterday. And the way it's cataloged in the government data, it's oil and coal more broadly. It would move that up from like number 3 or 4 on the list to clearly number 1 if we just said energy regulation. Those are the most burdensome, most costly areas, but not always the most intrusive.
So let's talk about kind of how the burden plays out. First, so there's the federal, this is only at the federal level, and then I assume that these federal regulations often interact with state and local regulations, right?
That's right.
Right, and there's no system to actually make sure that these are not double burdens, and so that gets me to the question of what is the decision, what is the process that gets into adding regulations? Dan talks about how the process has been changed, not for the better. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, there are. We can think of it as 2 main drivers, and I'm being fairly abstract here. The first driver is new law, right? We have new statute, right? By effect, by economic consequence, probably the most regulatory law in history is the Clean Air Act. But the most regulatory law in history by compliance and how much had to be done and what it spawned for the legal industry, believe it or not, started with the following 8 words. In 1996, it was enacted in February, and it started in the preamble with, in order to promote competition and deregulate. It was the Telecom Act of 1996. This was superseded a few years later by Sarbanes-Oxley as the most regulatory law ever, which was superseded a decade later by Dodd-Frank, which, as we look at the last 10 years, the implementation of some of the environmental laws around energy, clearly the way we deal with air quality and energy production, those are the most regulatory laws. All of those things are driven by statute, right? On the other hand, we have just this regulatory impetus. A great example was part of our discussion first straight away when we were talking about energy with Grant, about the FERC and the NERC and nuclear and what do we do about the grid security and all of these things. Well, regulators regulate. They come up with ideas about what to do, and they invent ways that their new idea fits within the current statutory construction. And that is not a partisan question. It comes regardless of who's in charge of the agencies or who's in charge of the White House. Regulators regulate, and we get a lot of new obligations on private enterprise from them.
Where does cost-benefit analysis fits in, and what kind of obligations are regulators subjected to, if any?
Yeah. On occasion, we will see Congress have the good sense to put into a law certain standards for the types of trade-offs that they want analyzed. As a general rule, we have a really messy system. The Office of Management and Budget, and more specifically within OMB, OIRA, is charged with monitoring and measuring and documenting these sorts of things. However, under the Paperwork Reduction Act, which is essentially a win for us, it's a good thing. It's a pro-market law. But under the Paperwork Reduction Act, independent agencies don't have to do cost benefit and report to OIRA. They get to choose whether to do the cost benefit for themselves and incorporate it into their analysis. What is supposed to happen is if you think your regulation will meet a certain threshold of cost, then you need net cost, then you need to do a full cost benefit analysis, submit it to the White House, the OMB team. They look it over and they look for net benefits.
So that used to be
yeah.
100 million, and now it's 200 million. So does it mean that fewer regulations, new regulations, are actually subjected to the cost benefit analysis constraint?
This is a great point. Just in the last 15 months, I believe, or maybe it was 10 months, I think it was last summer, the Biden team, Biden OIRA, said, we're going to move the threshold from $100 million up to $200 million. We're going to double the threshold for where we want a cost-benefit analysis. And you would think that that would mean that if we have a flow of regulations coming from all of these agencies, that suddenly we're only going to look at the top layer, right? And we would no longer analyze the lower layer. The nominal number of rules that are still getting CBOs is about the same. It's because the Biden team, the rules that they're putting out are just bigger, more costly. And if anybody suggests to you a chart that says, the costs of regulations are staying stable under Biden because we have the same number at this threshold for analysis, it's because they doubled the threshold. It's not the actual effects, it's just the number of rules. And all it's done is reduce our ability to assess these trade-offs and give information to the democratically elected branches of government that would then provide some sort of accountability.
So let's talk actually about comparing the Trump administration, which has been touted as very good on regulation, and the Biden administration. First, do you agree that the Trump administration was good on deregulation? I mean, certainly, there was a lot of activity in a way that we never hear about it. And then how does it compare to the Biden years?
The most important takeaway on this point, on this question, is that we had a predictive choice to make about whether Trump or Clinton would be better. And hands down, unequivocally, it is an easy call. And that prediction was borne out. The Trump administration on net was not only better than the alternative, which is what matters in political economy, but it was pretty good. And it was really good for about 2.5 years, right? We use something, it's a report, it's generated by the government, about the government, called the Unified Agenda. And it gives you a forecast of major rules that are coming. And it gives you a forecast of things that agencies are studying, even if they have not called for a formal rulemaking process. They can say, we think there might be something we need to do in this area. And that Unified Agenda shows you the pipeline, like how many things are building up. And as we got into 2019 and 2020, that Unified Agenda and a couple other data points about plans from the Trump administration suggested that things might even out, right? Like they weren't going to be excellent the whole way. But I want to go back to the first point, right? Unequivocally, hands down, the choice was not a good Trump administration or a great Trump administration. The question was a Trump administration or a Clinton administration. Now, compared to the Biden administration, it's equally as clear. They are as much to the other side of the midpoint, but probably further. And there's something really important here that is not necessarily in Dan's paper, so I want to beg your indulgences. This is my own point for you. We have entered, as a result of President Biden and his administration, an entirely new era of progressive government. I think most of the people in this room and the people on your teams see the symptoms and you see the data, but we are not talking about it in this way. And so I just want to sketch it out very briefly. In the first 48 hours of the administration, the president revoked dozens of executive orders, right? Many of them regulatory, very good regulatory, procedural things that the Trump administration had done. In addition, in the first year, we had about a dozen announcements of whole of government. We have whole of government initiatives for bioengineering, for biomanufacture, for COVID. We have whole of government initiatives for equity, climate policy. The list goes on and on and on. And we even have something called a whole of society initiative for mental health. And I don't actually know what that means because they don't manage society, they manage agencies. The whole of government initiatives has fused, and this is a unholy union, the tremendous debt-fueled spending of the IRA, the Recovery Act, the CHIPS Act, these massive $1 trillion and $1 trillion plus bills with an agenda of DEI and ESG, equity, and climate policy. And it works the following way. And this is why the Biden administration is not just as far in the negative as the Trump administration was in the positive, but they go so much further. All of those trillions of dollars, remember, candidate Biden campaigned in 2020 with about $11 trillion of promised spending, and he's made a good start, right? To qualify for those programs, those loans, those grants, those initiatives, everything that comes through the system to qualify to get that money, which, by the way, we're borrowing, you have to fill out applications. You have to respond to RFPs. You have to fill out the documents created by the agency charged with administering it. They now include equity statements. Housing programs have climate policy baked in. What is your climate policy? The DEI program, because it's a whole of government, has created this whole of government initiative has created a permission structure for 432 regulatory agencies, 19 independent agencies, to regulate anything. That is fundamentally different than anything we've ever seen, and it's on a huge scale, multi-trillion-dollar scale. It is reshaping the relationship between private enterprise, because where's all this money flowing, right? It's going to universities and nonprofits, right? It's going to companies. We should talk about the CHIPS Act. It's going to all manner of private activity. And it's reshaping the relationship private activity has with the government by spending money and requiring that if you want the money, if you want the goods, you have to promise to do these DEI things, these ESG things. You have to promise to do this climate policy. If just one quick example.
And unions, right?
And the unions. One quick example. April, I want to say it was the 26th. Just 3 weeks ago, we got a new rule. It's a joint rule from the Department of Agriculture and HUD, housing, right? It is targeted at low-income and first-time home buyers. So this new rule from those two agencies which administer programs, USDA for poor rural homeowners or would-be homeowners, HUD for other low-income home buyers, they say to the FHA, in order for the FHA to back loans from commercial banks, those commercial banks must certify that the home construction meets new green standards which were adopted in 2021. So they're raising the cost of building homes. They're regulating it without statutory authority. They're doing it through indirect step to an independent, quasi-independent agency, FHA, and no one's watching this. The effect will be homes cost more, fewer people have access, and the programs are going to ask for more money.
I wonder whether we're going to get lucky and in a way the overreach, which is at a scale that we haven't seen, is going to backfire. So a lot of left of center pundits or economists are really frustrated. I mean, Ezra Klein calls it the everything bagel type of policy, basically that no spending comes without being loaded with all these requirements that they recognize are actually slowing down things. Noah Smith, the economist, actually complains a lot about the burden of NEPA and all of this. And I think there is a recognition that the reason why it takes so long to build anything is because of regulatory burden that has existed, but is being added. So let's talk about the possibility of, or actually maybe, is there a way we can use this recognition from the left that exists now to actually move towards a deregulatory agenda, and so if so, what needs to happen? I mean, a lot of what Trump did was at the executive level, which doesn't last, right? There's a possibility of Chevron being overturned, so that's a possibility. But then ultimately, it seems that, what is it that Congress needs to do? So can you talk about those three?
Small things.
Small.
So,
Small.
I want to try.
I trust you.
Noah and Ezra and kind of the commentary. First of all, I welcome it. You know, if Noah's going to write that, if we're going to get in the New York Times that everything bagel might not work, more power to him. God bless him. You know, I'm for it. But I will tell you, winning is better than losing, right? And that's losing. That's losing slowly, but it's losing. We want a deregulatory agenda. We want a pro-growth agenda. And there's a risk, and I'm not putting this at your feet. I think it's something that sits at the feet of every single one of us, every single one of our friends. We are elite. I mean, I don't usually feel that way, but we are. We think about this stuff. Most people are busy living their life doing other stuff. And there is a massive disconnect between the technocratic pundit class of the left and the ideologues and activists who are currently running the White House. They are not the same people. This is not a monolith that we're against. And if we need one example for this, I'll just suggest to you the difficulty it will be to get any of those folks who are, I believe, sincere. They're not bad people. They're wrong, consistently. To get them to reverse course on something like, let's look at, just for a moment, one narrow piece of the CHIPS Act. The CHIPS Act that has a civil rights program baked into it. The CHIPS Act, which has DEI requirements baked into it. The CHIPS Act, which was advertised as national security, microprocessors, and manufacturing. The CHIPS Act was put into law, and it took almost a month and a half before our Secretary of Commerce from this state, former governor of this state, she said, you know what? Anybody who gets $150 million worth of grants to build, you have to provide child care, right? 150 million, just to put this in scale, there's about a $52 billion line item for the building of fabs, of processor plants. That's about 0.25% of all the money available for building. If you apply for and are granted 0.25% of the whole pot, then you have to put in child care. Why did she do this? Well, she did this because just a year prior, 15 months ago, the president put forward a very forgettable item in his budget, $600 million for child care and early child education. Congress sensibly set it aside. The left couldn't get what they wanted, right? So she's ramming it. And the day that Noah and Ezra and all of my friends who are technocrats on the left will complain about that, then I think there's the silver lining.
But that said, I want to kind of raise maybe the possibility of the broader public noticing, right? Like, for instance, the Francis Key Bridge just collapsed, right? Last time, it was when they built it the first time, it took 5 years. And they had technology that was not the technology we have today. The news, I mean, it's going around this notion that it's going to take at least 10 years. So it's not just that because of the regulatory regime that we have, we've basically chosen stagnation over growth. But it is that, and so it's not just that it takes longer to do new things, right? It's that there are a lot of things that we used to do and we don't do anymore, or we do it worse, or it's much more expensive. I mean, and all of this actually boils down to a regulatory regime that is just really dragging the country down. And in part it's because of a precautionary principle, and I'm kind of hoping that the American people are starting to see. And I mean,
There's a presumption baked in there, and the fact pattern helps. It really helps our story. Mark might be the best to speak to this, but I'm pretty sure that if we investigate just one layer, right, that was a bridge built with private money and was privately tolled, right? And all of the discussions that we had about contracting and delivery standards and Pete Wilson's idea about the Santa Monica Freeway and these things, the presumption is that if we want to do things, not even big things, like the president talks about his moonshots, right, to cancer or whatever. If we want to do things that we have to rely on the public sector, that's the assumption that we have to get at. there are essentially two ways that we can make decisions as a group. And the group could be where do you go for dinner before a movie? The group could be this room, it could be the state of Rhode Island, the whole country. We make decisions either with market processes or with political decision making. In the former, we use institutions like pricing, contracts, it's cooperative. These are voluntary. These get things done. They solve problems. They deliver services, risks are taken and rewarded. When we socialize those risks and we privatize those rewards, when we use public decision-making, political decision-making, we walk ourselves into cronyism. We walk ourselves into the notion that the only way you can build a bridge is with Davis-Bacon labor and with this and with that, and you have to source the materials from all of these specific places. All of that political decision-making is less, it's not just less efficient, but it's less productive. And so the net productivity outputs just get dragged down. And it is to our benefit because I think it speaks to the intuitions of the American people. It's about who we are as a character, that we can do things. And that's the drag of regulation, is that the presumption's on the other side, is that somebody can tell you what to do, right?
I saw a tweet that had the copy of a page that is prepared, and no matter what one think about the goal, but the goal was looking at all the regulations that needed to be waived in order to build the southern wall, and it was like a list of 22 different regulations. So and it was Mallorca was going to have to be the one to waive all of these regulations. So I think there is an awareness that regulation is what is holding this country back. It's what's holding manufacturing in particular, but really all sorts of things. And so what are the steps we need to take to go about deregulating? So what does Congress need to do?
It's not the place I like to start, but it's the place that Congress tends to end up. So I'll start with, just on a basic point of message, right? It would be really helpful if our friends who go to work as lawmakers started talking about the notion that there are many forms of regulation in this world. We don't always need to use government regulation, right? Markets discipline market actors. Contracts, United Underwriters, they probably check the cord on all the wiring in here so that we don't get shocked, right? There's lots of private ways to regulate, and the least accountable, adaptive, responsive to changes in the market way of doing that is always going to be government, right? So that's the first thing. It's just a messaging point, is that we're not talking about having anarchy and Mad Max Thunderdome. We're talking about using what works to regulate so that we have more productivity, more growth, more job options for our children, we have more mobility, those sorts of things. As far as the practical policy steps, it's important. You highlighted it for us. Dan has a discussion, I think it's around page 30 of your booklets. There are two major cases in front of the Supreme Court. We're going to learn a lot more in the next 45 days, right, about the relationship between Congress and the agencies for how to interpret laws that tend to be vague, right? That process of whatever changes about the legal doctrine that we use the shorthand and call Chevron, delegation, that's going to take quite a while to filter through the system, right? I'm confident that the initial steps of that filtering are going to be quite positive, right? It's going to require better law and better behavior by regulators. Fundamentally, I'll tell the story of my lifetime of regulation in 3 quick chapters. And the third chapter is what we do next. First chapter, 1978 Air Deregulation Act, was one of 3 bills that together tackled sectoral regulation, the airline industry, right? One sector. Bipartisan, basically spearheaded by a longtime academic and professional regulator, a guy named Fred Kahn. The bill was drafted by Steve Breyer and Jim Miller, who later went on to be much more famous for things other than drafting that bill. And it was navigated through the Senate by Ted Kennedy, and 3 of the original 7 co-sponsors were Republicans. First 20 years, my late friend Jerry Ellig identified about $80 billion worth of value created by that deregulation. Sectoral, it matters, it helps move us forward. Chapter 2, I alluded to earlier. The Telecom Act was not necessarily deregulation. We went from closely regulated, utility-style, government-controlled, prices, service, entry and exit, all of these things, quality controls, to managed competition. What was important, the deficiencies that it had, it wasn't as complete as airline, but what was important and made it at least an order of magnitude more valuable to the American people, I estimated about $500 billion in the first 20 years, was that it was reaching at technologies and services that came across the entire economy. We would not have internet-enabled systems today if not for that move from utility-style regulation, and it has affected everything from GPS to cancer research. Today, those things are not sufficient, and they're not sufficient because of this whole of government problem that I discussed. Today, what we need are just fundamental, right at the base, attacks at regulation. What we regulate, we need to do less of it. How we repeal regulations ought to be easier than creating new ones. Currently, it's modestly more difficult to repeal something than to put something new in place. We need to go right at the heart of it. This is regulatory budgets. This is the CRO idea that is in the paper that's out in your booklets. Cost benefit. All of these things are procedural, but they go to the heart of why we regulate through the government. And if we don't start attacking the base, we're going to get eaten away at.
So I want to turn it to you now for questions. And so just, Mark,